Hey team, Coach Tickety here, and we're going to be talking about DPS in Overwatch 2. Whether you're here because you're new to the DPS role, you're mastering your one trick, or just trying to grow your understanding of the game, this video is for you. DPS is the most diverse cast in the game by far, with as many heroes available as both tank and support combined currently. The size of that roster alone gives us as players a lot of freedom when finding the heroes that best suit our playstyle, but can also lead to confusion when trying to find the best solution to problems in game. When should I pick Cassidy over Soldier 76? Should I go dive in as Genji or hang back as Widowmaker? Today, we're going to be trying to define some of the characteristics that give these heroes their situational strengths and help you understand what roles and playstyles you should keep in mind in order to maximize your potential on DPS. A couple quick notes though before getting started. Number 1, the information in this video is based on all currently available information for Overwatch 2, which is still in active development. It's expected to see new hero releases, balance updates, and reworks that make the information in this video obsolete. If that does happen, be sure to let me know in the comment section what kind of updates you guys want me to cover on this channel. And number 2, this is not a tier list. The purpose of this video is not to tell you what heroes you should be playing, but rather what playstyles each hero will benefit from the most. My 5-star ranking system is far from perfect, and it's meant to give a general idea of the potential of each hero, not compare them against each other necessarily. Also, heroes in Overwatch can be played very flexibly. This video shouldn't be a frame that limits the way you approach the game, but rather a baseline, a starting point for you to build upon with your own understanding of the heroes. So with that in mind, let's get into some DPS characteristics. First up, we're going to be talking about endurance, and we'll be defining this as the ability of the hero to withstand direct pressure. This will be a combination of HP pool, defensive cooldowns, and mobility. Keeping in mind, this isn't just about surviving when you're getting engaged on, but the hero's ability to extend their kit throughout a team fight. High endurance will mean these characters can play more solo-oriented playstyles and rely less on utility from their team. They can play the map more often, they can take duels more often, they can last longer in the team fight. Next up, we've got burst versus sustained damage, and we'll have this as two separate stats. So burst damage will be defined as any amount of damage that creates an immediate advantage when hit within a short window. So some obvious advantages might look like eliminations or forcing the enemy to retreat or use defensive cooldowns. Versus sustained damage, which we'll be defining as damage that benefits from longer engages with a consistent damage output. And consistent just meaning you'll have similar expected damage output before, during, and after the use of defensive resources from the enemy. So whether there's a shield put in your face, the enemy's moving around the map, or they've used defensive cooldowns like, say, Baptiste Immortality Field, can you keep doing consistent damage through all of that? And finally, effective range. And this one's going to be a bit different. We're not going to be using our 5-star rating system, but this is going to be broken into 4 blocks, from short to mid to long to extreme ranges. And the numbers aren't hard set on these, but you can visualize this as about 15-meter chunks in game. So short meaning between 0 and 15 meters to your target, mid meaning 15 to 30, long meaning 30 to 45, and extreme being anything longer than 45 meters. If you're not sure what that looks like in game, you can check out this spot in the training range to estimate effective ranges in your games of Overwatch. And now with these characteristics in mind, let's talk about what archetypes DPS will likely play into when choosing their playstyles. So a couple notes about these archetypes. If you've seen my tank video, things are going to look a little bit different here. Firstly, I don't think DPS can be defined as linearly as tanks can in Overwatch 2. There's not a single stat that most DPS lean heavily into, and those single stats do not define their entire playstyle. For example, there's very different heroes that have strong burst damage. Widowmaker has extremely strong burst damage, but so does Reaper. Does that mean that they're similar types of heroes, or they should think about taking teamfights the same way? Of course not. So when we're defining archetypes here, it's going to be a combination of all the different characteristics, both their strengths and weaknesses, that help define these DPS archetypes. This means that there are multiple molds that each DPS can potentially fill when choosing your playstyle. This doesn't mean that there's one that's better than the other, but that usually means you've got options when choosing your playstyle for these heroes. So let's break these down. First up is our anchors, and this is probably the most straightforward FPS type role that we're going to see in Overwatch. These are characterized by strong sustained damage, mid or longer effective ranges, and typically suffer from having lower burst damage values. These are the standard FPS hero. These are the characters like to sit back in your backline and throw damage towards the enemy team. Pretty straightforward. Next up, in contrast to anchors, we of course have flankers. These will be characterized typically by strong amounts of burst damage, high endurance, typically associated with mobility for them to be able to play the map by themselves, and is typically also characterized by having low sustain values. Next up, snipers, another fairly straightforward term for most, I'm sure, characterized by having that strong burst damage, high range of course, at the cost of typically having lower endurance. Next up, scrappers, who will be characterized by having high endurance, in this case typically tied to defensive cooldowns more so than mobility, have typically a shorter to mid range, and benefit from strong sustain as well. And finally, our last category here, and this one's a bit more awkward to define than others, I've simply called these specialists. Now, these types of heroes will likely also fit into other archetypes, but worth highlighting specific areas of their kit need to be exploited in order to benefit from picking these types of heroes. We'll break this down on an individual basis, but just understand there's more than just doing damage that's required to understand how to play these heroes and how to maximize their potential. So, with all that in mind, let's get into the stat cards, and then we'll also be describing how these heroes can play into their associated archetypes. So, top of the list, starting with Ashe, which we've labeled as both an anchor and a sniper. Low endurance, because Coach Gun is her only mobility tool, but it does offer some verticality and a mild form of CC, unlike some of the other DPS. She's got high burst because of her headshot damage alone, but also because of the dynamite threat. Hitting big dynamites, hitting those headshots should cause immediate panic in the enemy team. She also has strong sustain, but it is gated by an awkward reload time, so she'll be able to do a lot of damage for a long amount of time as long as she's got the bullets for it. And she'll be effective anywhere in the mid to long ranges. So how does Ashe play as an anchor? Pretty straightforward. She'll want to hold back, use her tanks as a distraction tool to buy her time to make sure she's getting precision headshots onto vulnerable members, and if needed, using dynamite to finish kills, flush people out of cover, or just hit as many targets in front of her as possible. As a sniper, Ashe functions very similarly, but she'll be hunting for more of those one-shot potentials with a combination of a scoped-in headshot and an unscoped body shot or headshot will finish most 200 HP heroes. Next up, Bastion, who's labeled as an anchor/specialist. So Bastion, relatively weak mobility options and no defensive CDs means he gets a 1-star for endurance, which he only really gets because of his higher HP pool and his available armor. He does have very strong burst damage, however, in his ability to pump out some of the strongest DPS in the game in his sentry mode, and also has some decent burst options from his grenade and his ultimate ability. His sustain does suffer a little bit though. While he does last in sentry mode for a decent amount of time, his damage output while in recon is severely limiting, and it's gated not only by having strong mechanics, but also the slow fire rate. He'll be effective at mid ranges. He's an anchor because you want to play for the sheer amount of damage he puts out during a teamfight. You want him protected at all costs to make sure he has the opportunity to go for those damage windows. But he's also a specialist because understanding your timing and your target focus when using sentry mode, when transforming into that turret, is crucial for Bastion. If you are shut down, booped out of position, slept by an Ana, defense matrix by a D.Va during this cooldown, you basically don't get to do much else meaningful during a team fight. Incredibly important to know how to maximize effectiveness while in turret form in order to get the most out of Bastion. That's why we're putting him at a specialist here. Next up, Cassidy, and he's solo labeled as an anchor. Weak endurance because he got very limiting movement options with no vertical mobility, and he no longer has crowd control on his flashbang. But he does have significant burst damage now. He's got the of course, the consistent burst damage option of landing a headshot, and now he's also got the mag grenade, which when comboed with a single body shot will do upwards of 200 damage. Lots of options to instantly pick off low HP targets with his kit here. He also has very strong sustain. He is a very consistent threat with high damage and a relatively high fire rate on his pistol, and as long as he has the space, he will be a consistent damage dealer for most teams. Cassidy will be effective at short to mid ranges, but you're typically only looking to hit those short ranges when you are going for those mag grenades. We have him labeled as an anchor because fairly obviously he doesn't have a lot of tools to create opportunities himself, to work the map, to go on flanks, to play extreme ranges, but he can absolutely clean up a team fight as long as he's given the space for it. You'll want to protect your Cassidy players and make sure he's able to keep shooting for as long as possible. Echo, who we labeled as both a flanker and a scrapper. High endurance because Echo has one of the most flexible mobility tools in the game on a relatively short cooldown. Unfortunately though, because it is her only single defensive cooldown, it can be punished whenever she doesn't have it available. Of course, when you have duplicate, this can be supplemented with your get out of jail free card, but for the most part, Echo is only gated by her ability to fly around the map. She has extremely strong burst damage though. She can even take tanks from 100 to 0 if she lands all of her abilities. The constant threat of sticky bombs and focusing beam can never be ignored when Echo is in range to hit them. She has decent sustained damage from consistent pressure from her primary fire and a relatively short cooldown on all of her abilities, and this is actually mainly gated by her single mobility cooldown again. She needs to make sure she's getting into positions to hit those shots, otherwise it becomes a lot easier to see them coming and get out of the way. Echo will be effective at short to mid ranges. That short range typically reserved when you're going for that all-in combo of sticky bombs plus focusing beam, and just making sure that you can finish your targets. We have her labeled as a flanker because of her strong mobility and the ability to take interesting angles around the map, as well as strong dueling potential means she can play solo fairly often, but she will benefit from some pocket healing, of course. She's also labeled here as a scrapper because of her relatively short cooldowns. Her damage output does come in bursts typically, but she will have enough in her kit to fill the gaps between those burst options, and she will usually find opportunities to hit multiple burst windows throughout a single team fight. So she's never one to be left out, and she does want to keep going in on multiple targets whenever she finds the opportunities. Next up, Genji, who once again we've labeled as a flanker and a scrapper. His endurance is relatively high. He's got very flexible movement options with his wall climb and double jump. He's got a mobility and technically could be used as a defensive cooldown in his dash, and of course he has the reflect to extend his pressure and help him in 1v1 situations. He's got a very flexible mix-up game to keep enemies guessing about when he's approaching or when he's about to commit to a fight. Very strong burst damage, a very strong one-shot potential on most 200 HP heroes with his dash plus secondary fire into the head, and Genji is able to capitalize on burst situations nearly instantly whenever he sees low HP targets. The availability of dash, the amount of damage it does, and the reset potential on it makes him extremely scary in burst situations. This is augmented by having Dragon Blade available and by finding those kills to reset his dash, and that also supplements his endurance with faster movement speed when he has the Dragon Blade out, and of course the dash resets to help him get back to safety after he goes in. Sustained damage does suffer on Genji a little bit. He has the poke damage from his primary fire, and he does have the potential to sustain a fight by constantly chasing and getting dash resets, but these are very situational and typically not what Genji is thinking about most of the time. You should be looking for those burst opportunities whenever you can, not always trying to extend a team fight and look for multiple dash resets. He'll be most effective at short range. Of course, you have the poke range that doesn't fall off at longer ranges, but that damage isn't quite as meaningful and is mainly used as simply a tool to poke down targets when you've got nothing else to do or to charge your Dragon Blade. Genji's labeled as a flanker because of his obviously high endurance and 1v1 potential, his ability to move around the map very fluidly, but he's also labeled as a scrapper because of that dash reset potential and because of the chaos that ensues when a Genji is using Dragon Blade. He's a very strong extended team fight abuser when he is able to get those dash resets especially. Hanzo, labeled as an anchor and a sniper. Relatively low endurance, while he does have decent mobility options with his wall climb and lunge, it doesn't do much to get him out of high pressure situations. He doesn't have a lot of outplay potential with his mobility to make sure he can survive getting engaged on. His burst, however, is nothing to be ignored. He obviously has the one-shot potential from his arrows, which has no fall-off, by the way, because it is a projectile, so this is effective at almost every range. And he also has a burst window with his storm arrows, which is effective for burning down tank HP pools or helping you get the last shot on a half HP target. His sustain is also relatively high. With no reload requirement, he will always be looking to create pressure from his arrows. He's got strong shield break, he's got strong tank busting powers with his storm arrows, like we mentioned, and he's always going to be looking to get those extra shots in throughout an extended team fight. Hanzo will be most effective at mid to long ranges. He can, of course, still be effective at short ranges or extreme ranges, like I mentioned, no fall off on his arrows, but he becomes noticeably less consistent, and he'll only really be effective at short ranges when he has his storm bow available. We have him labeled as an anchor here because his strong sustain, meaning he's always able to put the same amount of damage output no matter what the situation, whether that's into shields or into heads, makes him a very strong anchor, but also his one-shot potential on the arrows means he can play more like a sniper. He can play more aggressive angles, he can try to get over and around shields rather than burst through them, and he can benefit from taking aggressive angles early, looking for those one-shot potentials. Next up, Junkrat, and we've labeled him as an anchor, flanker, and scrapper all in one. So let's break down his kit. Decent endurance with some mobility and disengage tools with his concussive mines, but obviously with that being his only option, he doesn't have the same tools as other characters to help him survive in high pressure situations. Strong burst damage and one-shot potential here from his concussive mines and primary fire combo, but it does rely on strong mechanics and, of course, getting in range to hit those abilities. Sustained damage, however, is extremely strong. So strong you don't even need to aim it half the time for it to find value. His primary fire alone is extremely reliable for finding that sustained damage with no fall-off, but of course, like I mentioned, hitting it at longer ranges or hitting exactly the targets you're meaning to hit can be somewhat limiting. Junkrat will be most effective at short to mid ranges. Again, short, you'll be looking for those one-shot assassination attempts with his primary fire and concussive mine combo, but also anything beyond a mid-range will prove a lot more difficult to hit the targets you're trying to hit. We have him labeled as an anchor because, like I mentioned, the sheer amount of damage that he puts out sustain-wise is insane, and if fights last long enough, Junkrat will absolutely tear through everyone's HP pool. We've also labeled him as a flanker simply because his ability to go on flanks, find one-shots, and get himself out of sticky situations with the concussive mine has proved to be effective all the way up into the Overwatch League. I'm sure everyone remembers the Junkrat popularizing this playstyle. And finally, we've also labeled him as a scrapper, since once a fight gets going, as long as he's got concussive mines available, he can be an extremely slippery target, and he's also one that will benefit from chaotic situations where people have a hard time focusing him down, and he's able to close those distances to make landing shots easier. Next up, Mei, who we've labeled as both a scrapper and specialist. Mei maxing out the endurance stat here with not only her high HP pool, but two very strong defensive cooldowns in her Ice Block and Ice Wall, one of which making her invulnerable and restoring her HP. It would be impossible not to give Mei 5 stars in endurance. Burst damage, however, she doesn't really have any options. Outside of hitting her icicle headshots, which it can be somewhat unreliable, Mei doesn't really benefit from a lot of burst opportunities. Sustain-wise, however, we do have a lot of tools in our kit. Not only can we slow targets with our primary fire, but now with her changes in Overwatch 2, the primary fire actually does decent damage, as well as having tools to supplement her short range by giving her a higher HP pool, keeping targets within short range with the slow, as well as the Mei wall, means she does benefit from a longer engage and being able to slow potentially multiple targets. She will be effective at short to mid-range, most effective at short, but of course the icicles cannot be ignored at mid-ranges, potentially longer if you're able to hit some lucky shots. We have her labeled as a scrapper because obviously she's got a lot of tools to stay alive and cause chaos throughout an extended teamfight, and she will be looking to close those distances and manipulate the terrain around her whenever fights do get started. We also have Mei labeled as a specialist mainly because of the creativity that she can find with her Ice Wall. This can be used as a defensive tool, an aggressive tool, a mobility tool, maybe even a self-sustain tool. if used in the right hands. Thinking about playing Mei means needing to find value with your Ice Wall, otherwise you'd probably be doing more with a different hero. Pharah, who we have labeled as an anchor, flanker, and specialist. So first up with endurance, she gets 3 stars here mainly because of her ability to stay airborne for 99% of the game when she chooses. She also has the concussive blast for a movement option or a disengage option if enemies get too close. So decent endurance, but is obviously gated by strong mechanics, knowing how to stay airborne, and of course being able to play maps from the air in a smart way. Burst damage is relatively strong, but it can be gated by mechanics, and sometimes also gated by the need to get within close range. It is strong burst damage whenever you do hit a rocket, especially if it happens to be damage boosted by a pocketing Mercy, but the opportunity to follow up that burst damage is typically pretty limiting unless you're within almost melee range to hit the follow-up shot. Sustain-wise though, because of her projectile rockets, because of the sheer amount of damage they put out, and because they have no fall-off damage, it's incredibly reliable. It can, of course, be hard to hit at longer ranges, but this is an incredibly consistent form of damage output. It's just about being able to find the priority targets with it when you need to. Pharah will be effective at mid to extreme ranges because of her lack of damage fall-off on her rockets, and she still can be very effective at short ranges in burst situations. So, for example, if she's going all in on a target trying to hit 2 direct rockets, or if she's going all in to try and hit an early barrage, she can, of course, be effective at short ranges, but not 100% of the time. We have her labeled as an anchor simply because of her strong sustain damage. If Pharah does nothing else but sit back and lob rockets into a fight, as long as she's hitting a few targets, she will be finding consistent value throughout that team fight. We've also labeled her as a flanker because looking for those all-in opportunities to hit your ultimate or hit some directs that find a kill in the backline is incredibly important for Pharah, and leaning into that playstyle when it becomes available is part of learning Pharah's kit as a whole. And finally, we've also labeled her as a specialist simply because her ability to stay airborne is so unique, and maximizing the potential of the unique angles that you can take as Pharah is incredibly important, again, to maximize the value of her kit. Next up, Reaper. We've labeled him as both a flanker and a scrapper. High endurance on Reaper, not because of mobility options, even though he has his teleport, but mainly because of the lifesteal on his shotguns and his Wraith ability. Being able to keep himself alive and survive any form of direct pressure is an incredible tool on Reaper. Very strong burst opportunities, gated only by, of course, his short range on his shotguns, but his Hellfire shotguns can even one-shot 200 HP heroes if all the pellets do hit the head, so incredible burst damage, something that can never be ignored. Sustain-wise, he has decent sustain damage, but of course it is gated by his short range like I mentioned, and his single-use defensive cooldown. It's very hard to find that sustained damage when he's already used Wraith because it's very difficult and very threatening to stay within that close range needed to do consistent damage. And of course, I've been alluding to it this whole time, Reaper is only really effective at short ranges. We've labeled him as a flanker because looking for opportunities to play the map, force 1v1 situations, or get behind enemy teams is very relevant for someone like Reaper. And we've also labeled him as a scrapper because he does rely on that close range and he does have a lot of tools to extend a team fight once he gets it going, assuming he doesn't have too much pressure on him. Next up, Sojourn, who we've labeled as an anchor, flanker, and sniper. Starting with endurance, she's not great, but she's not bad. She does have decent mobility in her power slide and somewhat of a defensive cooldown in her disruptor shot, but realistically, neither of these cooldowns are extremely strong at dealing with direct pressure, and if she finds herself in a poor position, she will quickly be punished. She has very strong burst damage from the railgun, but is of course gated by being able to charge that railgun. She does not have the same level of consistent burst threat as someone like a Widowmaker or a Hanzo, even if she does have the one-shot potential. Sustain-wise, she does put out decent sustained damage, but the primary fire is mainly just used as a tool to build her railgun, and most of this sustained pressure will come from multiple shots from the railgun, more so than it will come from the damage from the primary fire itself. Sojourn will be most effective at mid to long ranges. She will technically be effective at extreme ranges since the railgun and her primary fire do not suffer from fall-off damage, but it is extremely inconsistent to be able to line up meaningful shots at those ranges. She can also be somewhat effective at short ranges, but mainly for unique all-in type situations where you just want to guarantee landing the railgun into the body. We have her labeled as an anchor because, pretty self-explanatory, she benefits a lot from being able to charge up multiple railgun shots, which can benefit from having the normal time and space available to her, like most anchors. But we also have her labeled as a flanker because when she does have that railgun charge, she can look for a lot more aggressive opportunities. She can use her mobility to hit high ground, she can get around enemy defensive utility and look for burst options. And finally, of course, we would not be able to ignore her ability to play as a sniper. Whenever she does have that railgun charged, or again, has her ultimate in use, she'll be able to look for as many one-shot potential headshots as possible from near unlimited range. Next up, Soldier 76. Also similar to Cassidy, labeled as a solo anchor here. He does have higher endurance than most anchors with his ability to sprint around the map and use his biotic field for some self-healing, but it's still not the greatest tool for playing that space aggressively compared to other high endurance members who can use their mobility and maintain space. Soldier's mainly using his endurance to run away from trouble. He's got okay burst damage from his Helix rockets, but this is something not typically dependent on unless you're catching someone off guard or looking to start or finish an individual kill. But Soldier does have extremely strong sustained damage. He's able to get damage done very consistently throughout a fight, and his ability to sprint means that even when he's being met by defensive utility, say shields in his face, he's usually able to find some quick repositioning to give himself a more beneficial angle to benefit even further from longer team fights. Soldier will be most effective at mid to long ranges. Anything longer than that, and he will suffer from significant damage fall off. Anything shorter than that will make him a little bit uncomfortable unless he's able to hit a nicely placed Helix rocket. We have him labeled as an anchor, pretty straightforward, because he likes to sit back and shoot his weapon. Playing for longer team fights with a Soldier 76 on your team will never be a bad thing. Sombra, who we've labeled as both a flanker and specialist. She's got relatively high endurance, this time not necessarily because she's got strong defensive tools or the best mobility, but because of her stealth and her invisibility. She does have the translocator as an extra get out of jail free card, but because this usually takes her completely out of a fight, it is hard to count this in terms of endurance rather than just a reset tool. But her invisibility alone lets her work very independently, find more information than almost anyone else in the cast. Her burst damage is decent. Being able to hack a priority target and get the increased damage window onto them is decent, but not as strong as a lot of other burst options in the game. The highest burst she'll offer will be the flat 40% of current HP that is dealt whenever she lands an EMP, and then of course the follow-up damage onto hacked targets. But because it is tied solely to her ultimate, it is not a consistent tool to always be playing for as Sombra, but is a good thing to play into, obviously, when you have that EMP available. Her sustain, also middle of the pack. It is decent sustain, but of course, like I said, if she is ever forced out of the fight, forced to use her translocator, it's basically a full reset for Sombra. She is not able to maintain consistent pressure onto those threats unless she is never being responded to herself. Making sure that you're able to get damage in the right opportunities, not always look for the longest opportunities on someone like Sombra. And of course, Sombra's effective range will be short. Anything longer than this will be outside of her reach for hacking targets and will suffer from the spread and fall-off damage on her weapon. Sombra is labeled as a flanker because, of course, her invisibility lets her play anywhere she wants to on the map, and she can create very unique opportunities that not many other heroes, even flankers, can. But she's also labeled as a specialist mainly because of the hack mechanic. There are no other abilities like this in the game, and understanding how to use hack effectively is incredibly strong for Sombra, whether it's to help you burn down an isolated target, whether it's to interrupt high priority cooldowns, or whether it's being able to hit the high value EMPs. All of these are incredibly important and incredibly unique to Sombra. So learning how to play Sombra isn't just about doing damage, but finding meaningful hack targets too. Next up, Symmetra, who we have labeled as only a specialist. As of the time of making this video, the devs have talked openly about wanting to rework or at least tweak this character, so it's unclear what direction she might be looking at when the full release of Overwatch 2 comes around. But for now, she's in a bit of an awkward spot. She doesn't have very strong endurance. If you can even call it a defensive cooldown. Her only one is her TP, but it's gated by a long cooldown and not very reliable in the middle of a team fight. She has some burst damage from her secondary fire, but it does become very unreliable to hit at range. She can also technically look for burst opportunities with what people call TP bombs, where she'll use a teleporter to get multiple turrets into the enemy team. But again, this isn't really that strong in terms of burst damage and is very situational. Sustain-wise, again, she's kind of just okay. She's gated very heavily by her short range, and lack of defensive options means, unlike someone like Reaper, for example, she doesn't have an easy time staying in a fight, meaning her damage will suffer whenever she gets some pushback. The sustain potential from her secondary fire also very unreliable. Her effective range will primarily be short to mid. Anything beyond mid range will be out of TP range and very unreliable to hit with her secondary fire. And basically for her to do reliable damage, she'll need to play in short ranges and play for her ramping primary fire, which is, again, very hard to find value with in Overwatch 2. We have her labeled as solely a specialist. If she had to be put into another archetype, it would probably be Scrapper, but she realistically doesn't have the endurance to benefit from extended engages. Even if her weapon does, the rest of her kit doesn't really allow her to play like that. But as a specialist, it is very important to get value out of your teleporter, of course. Being able to use this as a really creative mobility tool, not only for yourself, but for your teammates, can prove to be very strong. We've seen lots of instances where a teleporter can mean the difference between an enemy knowing how to hold a position versus being completely overrun from something they didn't even know was possible. So knowing how to play Sim means knowing how to get use of her full kit, not just her weapon. Make sure we're getting use out of her teleporter. Even her turrets can use some creative thinking when getting maximum potential out of this hero.
Oh my god, right over the roof! Okay, there's no way Paris Eternal were expecting this.
Next up, Torbjorn, who we've got labeled as an anchor, scrapper, and specialist. His endurance is middle of the pack. He's got no mobility, but his high HP and armor pool, plus his ability Overload, means he can outlive most high pressure situations, even if he's not able to play the map super effectively with mobility. He has decent burst options with either hitting headshots with his primary fire or hitting targets up close with his secondary fire, but that one's gated by close range and it is weaker than other shotguns in the game. And the primary fire, of course, being gated by being able to hit those targets with a projectile. Sustain-wise, though, he's got some of the best sustain damage in the game. The projectile of his primary fire has no fall-off damage, meaning he can reposition safely without losing damage output. And of course, the longer a team fight goes, the more damage his turret will be doing, shooting on as many targets as within its LOS. Very worrisome to go up against a Torbjorn with his turret up for too long of a team fight. He will be most effective at short to mid ranges because of the mechanical requirements of hitting the projectile of his primary fire, but also to make sure that he's in range to benefit from crossfire angles from his turret. We have him labeled as an anchor because while his primary fire itself is a little less consistent than most, the sheer damage output from his projectile and from his turret can never be ignored for too long. It's often a high priority for teams to get rid of Torbjorn and or his turret in order to be able to survive extended engages, so playing for those angles can be very effective for a team. We also have him labeled as a scrapper because he does benefit from these longer engages in the short range. He's got almost a budget tank HP pool whenever he does use Overload, and he's able to survive a lot of direct pressure, meaning he's able to get good amounts of damage in over an extended period of time. And like we mentioned, his turret will hopefully be blasting enemies throughout that entire team fight. And finally, we've also got him labeled as a specialist just because, of course, his turret placement needs some creativity and some thought process behind it in order to get maximum value. He has a very unique mechanic in his turret, and it is something you technically could just throw down on the ground in the middle of a team fight, but you will find consistently more value if you are thinking about the angles in which you want to set the turret up and what sort of team fights you're taking based around the turret's location. Next up, Tracer. We've got her labeled as a flanker and a scrapper. Endurance-wise, Tracer has extremely flexible mobility with both her blinks and her recall, and given the right priority on using these abilities, can be one of the most enduring DPS characters of all time. She also has a very high DPS window, both with her primary fire from her pulse pistols, and of course the pulse bomb in her ultimate that does charge relatively quickly. She can very easily delete enemy heroes whenever she's given the opportunity. The only reason we haven't put burst higher is because it is somewhat mechanically demanding, and Tracer did lose some damage on her primary fire coming into Overwatch 2. Sustain-wise, again, very strong potential here for Tracer, but this one's gated mainly on her cooldown usage. She will have strong sustain by being able to find multiple burst windows throughout a fight, but that's gated by whether or not she can make use out of her cooldowns effectively. If she burns recall too early, or she uses too many blinks and can't move around as quickly, she's not able to follow up with damage or keep herself as safe as she would otherwise to make sure she finds that sustained damage. The potential is there, but does require some discipline. And of course, Tracer's effective range will be limited to those short ranges within 15 meters. This is to make sure that she's getting the most out of her pulse fire effective range, and also that she stays at a threatening range to keep blinking and dancing around targets, throwing off their attention. We have her labeled as a flanker because she's got the tools to work very independently around the map. She can rely more on health packs than she can on ally healers especially, and of course she's got the burst damage required to be able to threaten from that independent space. We've also got her labeled as a scrapper because the more chaotic a team fight, the longer it lasts, typically the better targets Tracer will be able to find. She's got the endurance tied not to her health pool, but to her cooldowns to help her stay alive and stay active during these extended engages, and the longer it takes to lock her down means she'll be finding more and more beneficial opportunities to go all in and burst down high priority enemies. And finally, rounding out the list, we've got Widowmaker, who's solo labeled as a sniper, for pretty obvious reasons. She's got low endurance, with her only effective defensive cooldown being her grappling hook, which is also her only mobility tool for taking creative angles, meaning it needs to be used sparingly and with a lot of intent behind it. She's also got extremely strong burst potential. Any headshot given enough charge from Widowmaker's scoped in shots will kill most heroes. She has a lot of burst potential whenever she's able to line up those shots. Sustain-wise, it's okay, but we have it down here because even if she is able to get multiple shots off, it's very hard to develop your position to stay relevant for a longer team fight as Widowmaker. Once the enemy sees you, it's pretty easy for them to get out of the way or throw a shield in your face to stop you from getting follow-up damage. Widowmaker is most effective at long to extreme ranges. She can, of course, hit shots and do just as much damage in shorter ranges, but it becomes a lot less comfortable for Widow to work in those spaces, especially when characters can close the distance onto her and start forcing her to reposition. So now that we've seen how we break down each one of these DPS heroes and what roles they can play into, how should we be looking to use these roles in game? So now what we're going to do is we're going to do a brief breakdown of each of these roles, where they should be considered strong, and also what might be considered a counter to them. Looking at anchors, our most straightforward FPS type heroes, you want to play for time. You want to use your range and sustained damage output to outlast most enemy teams. You'll only usually be shut down by having too many mobile threats where you can't get the outgoing damage onto them, or to burst damage that limits your uptime during a fight. As flankers, you want to play the map, play space. You want to use your endurance to create more interesting engages by abusing flank routes, high grounds, and splitting up enemy attention. Try to create advantageous duels by moving around the map and choosing your targets wisely. Flankers will only usually be shut down by strong defensive utility. But in those situations, keep in mind you don't always have to go for the kill. Bleeding out enemy resources is also good value for a flanker. Snipers, of course, play your range. Don't be afraid of enemy anchors who usually outrange most of the cast, since you can usually outrange them. Put that burst damage to use and be the difference maker by finding those picks when it matters most. Make sure you've got your threats marked though, so you know when you need to reposition, since snipers will usually be shut down by enemy flankers. Scrappers, play your resources. Take advantageous fights knowing that you've got a deeper pool of resources to draw on in the middle of a team fight. Be careful not to have your resources drained before you start fighting though, or you won't be as effective. You'll usually be shut down by range, so make sure you're able to close the distance with a full pool of resources whenever you're going into a fight. And finally, specialists. Of course, hard to define, but try to play your unique mechanics. catch opponents off guard with the individual advantages that only these characters can create, and be the X factor that the enemy team doesn't always calculate into their plans before going into a team fight. And as a reminder, since most characters in the DPS pool I've put under multiple labels in terms of these DPS archetypes, this means that you can lean into these different playstyles depending on the situation. It doesn't mean that you can do both 100% of the time. Sometimes you'll play more as a flanker, sometimes you'll play more as an anchor, sometimes you'll play more as a scrapper, depending on the team fight, depending on the situation at hand. So keep that in mind and ask yourself, what tools do I need for the upcoming team fight, and how should I use my kit to best perform as a DPS? All right, that's all the heroes in the DPS cast, at least for now, for Overwatch 2. And those are a few of the ways that you can think about playing these heroes. Again, I don't want this video to serve as your only reference when thinking about how to find your own playstyle, how to play the game the way you want it to be played. But think of this as a fundamental baseline. This is what these characters are good at. These are the things in their kits that make them good at those things. So these are some playstyles that you might find success by leaning into. But there's endless room for creativity in a game like Overwatch, so don't be afraid to try and carve your own path and find something that works for you and something that you enjoy, most importantly. But that's going to be all from me today, team. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope this video helps you all in your Overwatch journey. Let me know in the comments what DPS hero combos you've been enjoying the most in Overwatch 2. And I'd like to say thank you once again to Questline Esports for helping me produce this video. Be sure to check out their channel and our show, The High Ground. There'll be links in the description below.